Thank you very much, sir. Up next, we have Mr. Burzine Waghmar. He's the inaugural Visiting India Fellow from the Royal United Service Institute, and he's joining us from London. Over to you, sir. Pankaj.
Good morning, everyone, and my best thanks to the USI-CHMS for this invitation to deliberate today through the good offices of Professor Siros. India's SCO Presidentship 2023, no Shanghai surprise. In my opening remarks to the United Services Institution for the first time, and on the first anniversary of the Ukraine war, it is entirely appropriate to recall, ladies and gentlemen, how telling was the starkness of Sino-Indian contrapositions when the Indian Prime Minister, who assumed the presidentship of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, at Samarkand, September 2022, publicly remonstrated a visibly discomfited Putin, reminding him, quote, "Today's era is not an era of war, and I have spoken to you on the phone about this," close quote. Lost in translation, to be sure, for the Indian Republic, which turned 75 last year, will host the SCO, whose working languages are Chinese and Russian. As an aside, this is the first time independent India, as far as I can tell, belongs to a grouping where the striking absence of English as an official language is evident. At least to me, and I trust it has not gone unnoticed among diplomats, scholars, correspondents, and Indian government officials. After all, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, began in April 1996 as the Treaty on Deepening Military Trust in Border Regions. Note the Chinese syntax and germ thought behind that nomenclature. And Chinese intentions and objectives are expressly not lost in that translation. It's the least of India's concerns which must assuredly query its participation, if not inclusion, in a Chinese inspired and designed forum, most of whose members are tacitly expected to bolster Beijing's security, guarantee its energy needs, and provide a market for its goods. And in so doing, also take a cue from the Chinese success story forged in command capitalism, scripted to produce automatons and foster a rules-based system distinctly different from that of the international, liberal, post-1945 consensus rules-based order. Not a few of the Central Asian stans have succumbed to this, but then it did not take much. For 70 odd years, most had been run by local party bosses, satraps who paid allegiance to the Kremlin and were allowed to run their fiefdoms. They still do so, despite finding themselves independent overnight. But that story, as the Russians would remind, is as old as the hills. Этот рассказ стар как мир. I need hardly rehearse here how an increasingly beleaguered, isolated Putin is in hock to Xi Jinping. And only yesterday, the Daily Telegraph, 23rd February, page 10, Putin declared to visiting Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi that Russia and China can help reset the world because, quote, cooperation between Russia and China can stabilize the international situation. Incidentally, these remarks occur not just on the eve of the first anniversary of the Ukraine war, but also Sino-Russian joint naval exercises off the South African coast. That Putin implies China can stabilize him is anybody's guess. Only a year ago, he sounded almost like a Pakistani official, claiming Sino-Russian ties have, quote, no limits, almost as the Pakistanis would say, sweeter than honey or deeper than the sea. But China does have its limits and red lines. Putin, as intelligence sources now reveal, did assure Xi Jinping on the eve of the Winter Olympics last spring that the Ukrainians would cave in and it would all be over within weeks. He deliberately postponed it so as to not steal their Chinese thunder until the 20th of February last year. 4 days after the closing ceremony in Beijing, he struck out at Kiev in the early morning hours of Thursday, February 24th. And speaking of joint military exercises, most Indians remain blissfully unaware that Russo-Pakistani Dosti Druzhba war games have been ongoing since 2016 and that the sixth in that series, lasting for a fortnight, finished in October 2021. India obviously chooses to downplay that, lest it pushes Putin further into Xi's embrace. The former, after all, was instrumental in pushing for India's inclusion in the SCO and far more voluble than Xi about New Delhi joining the Quad. But Sino-Indian frontier flare-ups have been ongoing since 2017, and it is the US that has spoken out to support India, not Russia. Again, Indians prefer to be ignorant of how the US has slapped CATSA sanctions, Public Law PL 11545, countering America's adversaries through the Sanctions Act on a NATO ally, Turkey, but not India, for purchasing those very S-400s surface-to-air missiles from Moscow. American congressmen were grilled on the Hill for justifying India's predicament and how it cannot be expected to wean itself off overnight from Russian weaponry and spare parts during a low-intensity border conflict. Again, starry-eyed Indians know nothing of this, who are quick to praise the USSR then, Russia now, as India's supposedly staunchest ally through thick and thin. The very same USSR whose Khrushchev, it is true, publicly declared Jammu and Kashmir is indisputably part of the Indian Union, but reneged on selling MiG-21s in July 1962, 3 months before war broke out in the Assam Himalayas, October 1962. Kennedy saved Nehru's skin by airlifting supplies, something lost on most Indians of successive generations. But older Indians, of course, remain in the know. Hence, it would be instructive to conclude this excursus before I proceed to my remarks on the current Central Asia scenario and the stance in the SCO by reminding all how Gorbachev, as last visiting Soviet premier in November 1986, made it plain to Rajiv Gandhi that Moscow could not be counted upon during any future Sino-Indian showdown. The Soviets, like the Indians, had a brief border war with Mao in 1969 on the Ussuri River in the subarctic wastes of the Russian Far East. Gorbachev initiated that demarcation settlement, leading to the first agreement in 1991, with both parties having formally declared that their border issues were resolved in 2003. An additional protocol was also inked in 2008. Russian silence is entirely justifiable, much to the helplessness of India. So, to return to Samarkand 2022, the Prime Minister of the world's largest parliamentary constitutional democracy chided a former KGB thug turned president for life for his unprovoked, unjustified use of force and human rights violations in Ukraine, whereas the only takeaway from that SCO summit by Xi Jinping was his memorable quote that we cannot allow attempts to provoke a color revolution among SCO member states. Georgia, the rose one, 2003-4, Ukraine, orange, 2004, Kyrgyzstan, pink, 2005, Iran, currently an observer which filed papers for formal SCO membership, Green Movement 2009, and even Russia, the Snow Revolution, briefly, 2011 to 2013, and Kazakhstan's Steppe Revolution, January 2022. Even as the September summit was underway, Russia was instigating the fertile and mineral-rich northern regions of Kazakhstan, where are domiciled ethnic Russians, to press for secession and break up Central Asia's largest republic. Russian minority demands led to the government shifting the capital from the north, Almaty, to the center of the country in Astana, December 1997, and to hold the place together. Kazakhstan has the world's second largest uranium ore deposits in the world, 19.4%, and massive undeveloped deposits of oil, gas, and other minerals. Securing a stable overland supply was not lost on the Chinese, who by the end of 2015 had invested some $26 billion in oil and gas pipelines. But Kazakhs realized the leverage both the Russians and the Chinese have, especially the latter, which has received a bad press in recent times over the illegal incarceration and re-education of ethnic dual-national Kazakhs, lumped alongside Uyghur Muslims in detention camps across Xinjiang. Blandishments of Russia and China remaining Kazakhstan's, quote, strategic partners has not exactly resolved any lingering issues which are kicked into the long steppeland grass. Again, as the Samarkand summit was underway, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the two poorest neighbors in stans, were engaged in a border clash. Not that the SCO served as a forum for resolving it. After all, ladies and gentlemen, as I stated at the outset, the SCO was set up to secure Chinese frontiers and steadily supply Beijing's economic needs. By touting that China does not interfere but respects the sanctity of internal affairs strains credulity, given the massive influence it wields behind the scenes to manipulate outcomes favorable to its requirements. The Kyrgyz-Tajik spat was one akin to that of enclaves. Think like those within the Indo-Bangladesh context of land and especially water rights. Consider this telling feature. Kyrgyz gas was bought in April 2014 by Russian state-run Gazprom for the princely sum of $1. It was reciprocally assured as an investment pledge of 600 million by Moscow for developing Kyrgyzstan's future energy needs. And it stands at just that, a pledge. And problems linger not just with ethnic neighboring Tajiks along the border, but Uzbek residents within. Riots began from the early 1990s, and the last bout in Kyrgyzstan 2010 saw some 426 dead, which strained relations with Tashkent. That was particularly acute, for it was the time the Uzbeks disrupted gas supplies to the Kyrgyz and was only restored once Moscow intervened to pressurize the former. All three republics had the Islamist menace to deal with in the most populous region of all Central Asia, the Fergana Valley, Emperor Babur's homeland, and a geographical region shared among all three states. Sunni militants of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan remain headquartered in Afghanistan, who make occasional incursions into Kyrgyzstan. Of all in the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, Tajikistan is the worst off since the dissolution of the USSR, for it was plunged into a protracted civil war 1992 to 1997. It has just about recovered. Dushanbe remains the world's most remittance-dependent state, as Tajiks working in menial or lowly positions across the Russian Federation keep their homes and the national exchequer going. Other Tajiks go off elsewhere. Syria, for one thing, to fight for the faith, and there has been some joint activity between the IS and Islamic Resistance Movement of Tajikistan, IRMT. Sino-Tajik trade now stands at 6,000% from $32 million to some $2 billion. That the trade imbalance is plainly in Beijing's favor need not be overemphasized. But what merits mentioning is how the Sino-Tajik boundary dispute now stands resolved following the parceling of 386 square miles of land in the Pamir Range by the Tajik parliament in 1999. The then Tajik foreign minister stated it constituted 5.5% of territory as desired by Beijing to ratify the boundary protocol in January 2011, which now naturally stands settled between them, much to Beijing's contentment, of course. The Iranians, currently an SCO observer and soon to be full member, claims its pound of flesh too. Tajiks are ethnically Iranian, but Sunnis, like their Turkic neighbors in the rest of the stans. Tehran inaugurated a drone factory, its first overseas, in Tajikistan, May 2022. Such technology transfer and other foreign direct investments by Iran over the years was in keeping with the tacit agreement to supply Moscow, whose military base in Tajikistan stands diminished with reduced manpower and equipment now transferred to the Western Front. 90% of all heroin consumed in Europe emanates from Afghanistan, all of which transits through Tajikistan. Coupled with Iranian anxieties over the twin dangers of the Islamic State Khorasan and Taliban, Tajikistan remains, like Afghanistan, the cockpit of Central Asia. It is in Tehran, Moscow, and China's interest to see it stabilize, especially after the return of Taliban 2.0. And here, perhaps remains something where India could actively participate in a forum where it is hemmed in between two authoritarian regimes who carve up spheres of influence in late 19th century fashion. A turbulent Afghanistan led India to initiate a collective gathering of all regional national security advisors to meet annually. This is imperative if India, which defines this region as its quote extended neighborhood, needs to keep its eye on the ball. The inaugural gathering of intelligence chiefs on 6th December 2022 was overdue, following the Biden administration's rash exit at the end of August 2021. Here, I would see India also playing a role in bolstering intelligence, terrorism, and drug combating with the CSTO, Collective Security Organization, which brings together Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia on counterterrorism cooperation. In any case, a rethink of Indo-Central Asian ties is vital. As C. Raja Mohan, a percipient India watcher, put it in an Indian Express opinion editorial, 27th December 2022, entitled, "Take a Hard Look at Moscow." India, as he contends, has for too long, quote, hitched its Eurasian wagon to the Russian star, close quote. It's time that this Indian caravan, trudging along the new Silk Road, sought new coordinates and rediscovered the region, its complex challenges, and modestly offer the Indian model as a substitute for the Sinitic one, which exhorts command capitalism and fosters censor-ridden illiberal societies. Russia, to be sure, will remain a player on the scene, albeit one whose standing remains seriously dented since last February. Weaning India away from this toxic defense dependability relationship is not enough. But at least it's a start. And the G20 and Quad, not SCO, is where India's core interests now lie. Thank you very much.